Hey, I want to talk a little bit today about refactoring and why people like to do it and why it's thought of as a positive but really tends to be a negative. And so I think we're all familiar with the definition of it. We take code which is working, but there's issues with the quality. It's hard to read. It's not well organized and so on. And we take it, we break it out into places where we are not repeating code. We take out things that didn't need to be there, restructure it, and so on, so that we go for something that's kind of ugly to something that's beautiful. And I think that's something that most developers have a very deep satisfaction of doing. We go in, we put our personal stamp on this. Sometimes there's a little bit of ego involved too, where we say, hey, I took this and I transformed it into something. I took what somebody else did and I did it better. And I think a lot of the materials read on code quality, beautiful code, good formatting, just everything under the sun. You're always going to see refactoring portrayed in a positive light. And I think that refactoring is something that can be helpful at times, but at the same time, I think that to get to the state of needing refactoring is showing some broken processes as well. And I think the value of refactoring is also greatly overstated a lot of the time. And so if we take a step back, we think about how most teams work, or even individuals are trying to solve a problem just on their own. You usually have like a time crunch, a resource crunch. And maybe a crunch isn't the wrong word, but there's always going to be limited resources to do something. And from an organizational perspective, if developers write code, it gets tested and deployed, defects aren't found. People external to the team just really don't care all that much. And this is kind of something that has really come to the forefront in the last couple of years, and like my own work and thinking that there's always going to be that tension, between hey, this is what people want. It's delivering value. It's putting the right thing out, but it could be a lot better, right? It's not something that's really easily readable. If you're trying to maintain it, you go through it and you're just kind of scratch your head a little bit. But honestly, unless somebody has to go work with the code, they just don't care. It's meeting the requirements, it passed, testing and so on, and people are actually using it. And so I think that kind of leaves developers a little bit of a hard spot. One thing is you may really have to go back and look at that code someday. And another thing is too is like we want to be able to put our stamp on something and say this is the best we can do with it. And refactoring just tends to be one of those ways we can put that stamp on it. But I think that the need to refactor really is pointing towards other deficiencies on a team, and there could be several causes for it. Particularly in an agile environment, you're going to have changes to requirements. You may have changes to functionality and stuff, and these could come. They could be more urgent than others, but more than likely, depending on your schedules, depending on how quickly things have to go out, depending how tolerant stakeholders or team management are for delays in code, there may not be that latitude to do it right. You'll have somebody comes in like well, we're trying to get some new functionality out based on what the organization wants. We have like 2 sprints to do it at most. And usually when you have a high priority request like that, there's also changes that happen too, because people don't necessarily know where what they want necessarily. And so we can look at the code and say, okay, we need to get this done, but we'll eventually have the time to go back and refactor it. And unless you really have a very high commitment to code quality and a tolerance for maintaining code, that time's probably not going to be there. You can have 5 stories on the board that need to be worked. You say you stand up, you're going to refactor some code, and you can kind of see your project manager, making dagger eyes at you basically. And again, that's kind of the tension too between development and people, not developers. But if you stop and think about how you get to the need for refactoring in the first place, what's the work methodology that's led to that, right? Do you have good code reviews? Are people feeling that they could be honest with the code review and say, hey, this code's garbage, I can't read it? There's a dynamic on the team. Do you have a good grasp on test first development? Are you writing code which is lean as and it's being refactored as it's written, right? Test first development slash test driven development. That's part of the idea is that you're going to write the test, then you write the code that passes that test. And if you're doing this, the idea is that you will minimize your code enough to the point where you're not necessarily going to be writing anything more than you really need to do. And so in that sense, refactoring is not so much done after the fact, but it's done during the code development, right? You want to have a test that's simple to pass. You need to know what the code's going to do in order to get that to pass. And if you're making that code easier to test, which is part, obviously, test first development, then more than likely you're going to have it broken in such a way, or not broken, but broken out in such a way that your test will be simple and easy to get it passed, right? That kind of avoids little things like having, one public method in a class and having 20 private methods, all of which call one another, and, people being satisfied with that somehow as being, testable because everything's broken out in different methods. It's like, no, you're just testing everything in a class. And do people follow the idea of good code craftsmanship when they're writing code? Are they writing redundant code, or or are they trying to keep the code dry and so on? And so if you're doing these things up front, you're almost refactoring as you go, and each one of those steps of work, if you're following proper disciplines and standards, will in essence trigger refactoring. Now it's obviously not refactoring in the sense of like taking this huge thing and reworking it, but really kind of minimizing the need to rework it in the first place. I think this gets critical too, because if we stop and think about, we get the code to where it's complete, it works, and we say, okay, it's not necessarily as elegant and clean as we want it, but we put it out there, it's passed our various code quality checks, it goes out to production, right? And, we might have a law and say, well, okay, let's go back and look at this code. And, we say, okay, this long function needs to be broken out into smaller functions. These need to be testable. Maybe, we need to put in an interface in front of a class where there wasn't one, and so on. And it's good, but, you can stop and think, too, that, even with that law, you probably have work that's coming up. And on top of that, let's say you do refactor something, and it may not make it out to production simply because QA might have to do a full regression test on it. If you change enough functionality to the point where you have enough things to where something can break, it may not be called initially. It's not going to get a whole lot of buy-in from anybody that's responsible for what that code does in production. They're going to take a look at this work and say, okay, well, do we really need to do that because the code's working? And you might respond by saying, well, yeah, because we need to be able to maintain it. But let's just say that, there's a small, piece of functionality that needs to be fixed because the defect is not caught until production. So I can either, make a quick change, it still has to be regression tested, but it's not at risk of breaking things. Or, I can say, hey, this is being refactored, needs to be fully regression tested. Okay, why does it need to be regression tested? Because everything changed. Why did it change? Because we refactored it. Why did it have to get refactored? Because we didn't write it right in the first place. And so it becomes a whole tension, I think, of, we want to have good quality code, but at the same time, we need to remember to do that code quality up front. And so I think, when should we refactor? I would almost say that as long as the code is written decently, is relatively performant, uh, is relatively readable, uh, then you don't. You've written something, you put out in production, it works. Nobody has an issue with it. Why mess with it, really? Yeah, again, it's nice to have that readable code, but is this something that delivers the most value at that point? Even from a technical perspective, is this something that delivers a lot of value? And really, probably most of the time, the answer is going to be no. And so I think there will be arguments in favor of refactoring based on how the code is. Somebody might say, well, it could run faster. We have, I don't know, we have code quality issues like, maybe triply nested loops or something god awful like that. And yeah, it might run faster, but is it going to be noticeable from a user perspective? Is this code all used often enough to where that will slow things down? Has anybody reported it being slower? If the answer is no, then you're basically doing work that has no value at that point. And there's other instances I could think of this, too. If something takes up too much memory. But again, is it something that's visible to the user, or is it invisible and they don't care because it's doing what they need it to do? And so I think that those things would actually be logged as defects, right? Let's say if it's running too long, that probably would be logged as a defect. And then you could go back and look at the code of being justified with refactoring, because that's going to address the performance issue. So unless there's really an issue from the user's perspective, it's not something that should be done. So I think that the time to refactor, if you are going to refactor, is when you have to go back in the code and work on it. And I think it becomes very justifiable by saying, okay, I need to make these changes to the code, but the code's not well written. I need to make changes to it, but it's going to be a lot of work to correctly have unit tests or integration tests around it. I need to make changes to this code, but I'm not sure like side effects if things are going to break or not, and so on. And in this sense, that's a time that I think you can justify, and I think it's a time where you can also get buy-in from your organization too. That to work on this code, I have to update it, and to update it, I have to make it cleaner, so that we increase quality without decreasing, or increase quality without drastically increasing the time to do something where we're not delivering value on it. And so that's kind of a little bit of a dicey thing, to have that conversation. But I've generally found if you go into these things, go to conversations like that, why will this take a little bit more time? You've done your research and you can point out why this is the case, and you're more than likely going to get at least some tolerance for doing that. So, those are some of my thoughts around refactoring. I think the bottom line again is you need to refactor as part of the initial work. It needs to be a product of understanding what good coding styles are, having the freedom and the liberty, I think, to make honestly very critical comments on a code review, and using proper practices. Really just kind of know what you're doing. Use your code craftsmanship things up front. Use these tools up front. Don't wait until later to really apply them. When you get in to do the work before you even do anything, take a moment, think about your design. Is it going to accommodate changes from the organization while the code's being worked, right? Is it structured well enough that the functionality needs to change? Is it going to be quick and easy to do it, or will the code have to be extensively reworked and so on? It's kind of a thing you pick up with experience, I think. You go down the road, you have it happen to you, a few times, you start getting a better sense for it. But I think the refactoring, like a lot of things we do with software engineering / software development, and we really need to take a second look at and really think of as the best, is it the best way to do things, or is it just an artifact which exists because it's the way things have been done? And that's a little bit of the point, I think, again, of, the way of code, in essence, like, let's find the better path. Let's find the more harmonious path, really. And in this case, again, that harmonious path is just going to be, do the quality work up front, take the time for those quality steps so that when you sign off on it, and it goes to the pipeline, you know you're going to be putting something out there that's relatively good quality, relatively readable, maintainable, and so on. Don't fight the process. I think don't fight the inertia you'll find in an organization. Work with what you're given and make sure that you're steering your work and creating your work in such a way that you don't necessarily go against those goals, but to support them. And I'm sure other people have thoughts. Feel free to put thoughts and comments. Again, be polite. Don't troll. But